sees at his back. The Leafs are doing pretty good, right, Jim? 2 wins. It's a miracle. Although, I have to tell you, I haven't watched very much hockey in the last 42 years. Because 42 years ago, I watched the greatest game in the history of hockey on the planet Earth. My dad used to take me down to the old Hamilton Forum. Some of you may know about that building, number 500 Barton Street East in Hamilton. It was the dirtiest, dingiest, most decrepit sporting arena in the history of the world. Every seat was behind the pillar. But we would go there and we loved it. I loved the Hamilton Red Wings. And the game that I'm talking about was in September of 1968. And who came to play the Hamilton Red Wings but, in a world news story, the Soviet Red Army. And it was the first time the team had ever been let out of the Soviet Union, and the world was in shock that this would happen. And where did they get to come to? The Hamilton Forum. Play the Red Wings. Oh, it was wonderful and beautiful. I remember standing there as they were starting out that night. We were right down close to the ice, and the Soviet Red Army team came out, and oh my gosh, they were just the meanest, toughest looking guys in the world. And I was terrified, thinking, these guys are Soviet communist soldiers. Did they arrive in tanks? I was afraid that at halftime they'd pull out machine guns and take us all hostage and take us back into the communist Soviet Union. It was horrifying. And as I stood there right close to the ice, their team lines up, and who is it that stands right in front of me? Vladislav Alexandrikov Tretiak. Oh, some of you remember, he was 18, he was nobody in 1968. In 1972, it was Tretiak who would lead the Soviet team in a 7-game series against Canada in the finals of that Summit Series. A 7-game series that went 8 games because we couldn't beat them. And it wasn't until there were only 34 seconds left in that last game, Paul Henderson, oh, you know this. But that night he stood there and they played the Soviet national anthem. Hardly anybody stood up. There was this real sense of animosity that these communists, these Red Army soldiers, then they played the Canadian national anthem. Hardly anybody stood up. Except I have to tell you, there was one bad thing about going to see hockey games in the old Forum with my dad. We were immigrants. We were new to the country. As soon as they began to play the anthem, oh, my dad would bolt to his feet. And he would belt out the Canadian national anthem in his Welsh accent. He was the only guy singing in the whole Forum. And I'm standing there beside, oh, Dad, don't do this. I remember that night he's singing right into Vladislav Alexandrikov Tretiak's ear. Oh, Canada. Oh. Tretiak looks over at us and sneers. He looks at my dad, he looks at me, and I'm standing there rolling my eyes. Tretiak looks back at my dad and looks at me again, and he goes like this. and I know what he was saying is good thing. Singing anthem, nothing wrong with that. In the car on the way home, I said, Dad, why do you do that? Why do you have to? Nobody else stands up, nobody else sings. You just stand up and sing the anthem. Why? My dad says, he says, we came to this country as immigrants. This is a great country. And he says in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Exodus, and in the book of Leviticus, God says to his people as they were about to enter the promised land, when you come into the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. You will never forget the Lord your God, and you will live every day with thanksgiving. My dad said, we are thankful to be here. And if ever they play the anthem, I will stand and I will sing it as my sign of thanks to be here. I always remember that. That was so great. And so, my dad was right. I'm glad to be here. I'm thankful. If they ever play the anthem, I will stand and sing it. That was the feeling and that was the emotion within which Thanksgiving was created. Sometimes we trace Thanksgiving back to that funny thing the Americans do with pilgrims and turkeys, and it's got nothing to do with that. It goes back beyond that thousands of years to that moment when the people crossed into the promised land, and God said to them, when you come into that land, you will remember and you will have thanksgiving. And He gave them no less than 3 Thanksgiving festivals. In the spring, they would celebrate the festival of the unleavened bread, the Passover, instituted in Leviticus 23:5, in which the people would sit down at a table in the new land. And once a year, every year, for the rest of forever, when they sat down at that meal, the youngest person in the family would turn to the oldest person at the table and say, why are we celebrating this meal? Why are we eating unleavened bread? Why are we eating these bitter herbs? And in the festival of the unleavened bread, the oldest person sitting at the table would turn to the youngest and say, because once we were slaves, the mighty hand of God lifted us up from slavery. And now we are free. God said you will never forget. You will live every moment with thanksgiving for your freedom. And then in the summertime comes the festival of the first fruits, the harvest thanksgiving, Leviticus 23:15, in which God says, when your crops begin to come in, the grain and the corn and the oats and the wheat, when they come in, harvest them all, and then you take the very, very best of what you harvest. First fruits. You bring them, and you give them to God. What that meant was you gave them to the community. You gave them to the people in need. And that was the second great festival of Thanksgiving. And then in the fall, they had the third festival of Thanksgiving. Sukkot, they called it. The festival of shelters. In which the people would live in tents. And they would live in tents once again to remind them that for 40 years in the wilderness they lived in tents. And now they have a permanent home. And God says, never forget that you lived in tents and you wandered. And I gave you a home. Leviticus 23:33. Festival of Sukkot, the festival of shelters, 3 festivals of thanksgiving when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You live with thanksgiving at all times. And in each one of those festivals, it is inherently built into the festival compassion towards the poor people. Whenever God talks about the harvest, God says to the people, when you take the harvest, you make sure you take into account the people that don't have anything, and you be generous with those people, because thanksgiving means generosity and a tender heart that reaches out to those who do not have enough for themselves. God instituted rules about the harvest. When you took your harvest, you never would harvest to the edge of your fields. You never harvested the corners of your fields. You left them, God said, for those people who have no food of their own, and you let them come in and take what they need. And the second rule was that whenever you take a harvest, you have one shot to go through your field or your vineyard or your olive grove, and whatever you don't get in that first harvest, you leave it there. So those who have nothing will come into your field and take the second harvest. All the festivals of thanksgiving have built into them this sense of care for those who do not have anything. I don't think I fully understood the institution of the Jewish Thanksgiving festivals until just recently in a discussion around the table at the Canadian Christian Jewish Consultation, talking to Rabbi Roy Tannenbaum of the synagogue Beth Zedek in Toronto. And I think I had expressed some ignorance about what it was to waste food by sacrificing it to God. And he said there was no waste. He said, you know what those festivals were? He said they were great big barbecues for the whole community.